The night air smelled of iron and pine. A small wind pushed the scent through the camp and over the bodies, and somewhere a dog barked twice and was silent. You stand at the edge of the clearing, boots sinking in damp soil, and the first thing you notice is light. Not campfires, but torches arranged like a fence, flickering red and orange against the trunks. Above them, the stars are indifferent. It is December, the winter of a campaign that should have been routine. You are a courier, pressed by cold, carrying a message between columns, and you have walked into something that was not meant to be discovered. What you see does not fit the stories told in taverns or the official dispatches. You expect trophies, banners, an execution to feed rumor. Instead, you smell a ritual. You hear a low chant from some watchman, and your eyes register a geometry of bodies that will not leave you. What Vlad had been doing at night was a message written in living wood and living flesh. What you thought you knew about intimidation, about terror as mere stagecraft, is too small. The question is simple and terrible. What kind of mind turns a battlefield into a lecture in fear? You will hear the answer and you will feel the logic. This account is based on contemporary chronicles, diplomatic letters carried across the Danube, and modern psychological analysis. Stay with me and you will understand not only the act, but the method and the reason the Ottomans whispered even when they laughed. He was born to a princely house, but raised at the edge of fear. As a child, Vlad learned to measure silence the way other boys measured weight. His earliest memory was not a toy, but the metallic taste of a father's anger, and the first teacher he remembers is hunger. In the first of the formative episodes, a wet winter trapped his family in a fortified keep, and food ran low. A noble named Stefan and a steward called Mihai bartered cheese and promises and then vanished. The boy watched men in masks come with ropes and a lantern and saw what authority did when it ran out of words. It taught him to read leverage. Later, sent as a political hostage to a rival court, Vlad endured days of purposefully slow indignities. He shared a cell with a young shepherd called Eli and an old notary named Petru, who taught him names of wounds and how humiliation could be catalogued and used. Those years of captivity were cold lessons. He learned the weight of waiting and the arithmetic of small cruelties. A fever took a friend, a tutor called Marin, and when the fever released him, he left a different boy, someone who had counted not stars, but chances. The crucible of childhood hunger, of being measured as an asset in diplomatic games, and the memory of trusted men disappearing into the dark created a ledger, in which fear and order were balances he could tilt. He believed that terror, applied precisely, could rewrite behavior faster than law or sermon. When he returned to power, the first months were a study in small purges and loud ceremonies. An assembly in the Great Hall brought nobles who had betrayed him, and among them were names that still circulated in whispers: Bon Stefan, Boyar Radu, and Dr. Andrei. The scene opened like theater. Candles were trimmed to guttering stubs, silk cloaks rustled, and a servant called Ovidio, nervous, spilled wine across an embroidered sleeve. Vlad listened. He asked questions slowly, the kind of slow that lets a man answer himself in his head. Then he ordered an inventory of deaths, both fiscal and moral. The purge was surgical. Some lost titles and lands, others were publicly flogged in a courtyard where the smell of manure and tin mingled with the copper tang of blood. Petru, the notary, read ledger entries out loud. Eli, the former shepherd, was made to recite each debt owed before a crowd. Mircea, the chamberlain, watched and did not join the protest. The message was delivered in ceremony and in consequence, and the public understood the grammar of punishment. It was the method that mattered, not chaos, but a steady, painfully visible correction. People began to walk straighter and to lower their voices when the prince approached. The first public application of terror was not chaos, it was pedagogy. Loss hardened planning. A caravan carrying grain, intended to grease alliances, was ambushed on a March night by bandits who counted as friends. The caravan included a young aide named Luca and a merchant called Goron who managed the ledgers. Their bodies were found stripped near a river and their throats cut with a cruelty meant to humiliate. Vlad grieved in a private way and then withdrew for months into the hills with a small council that included Marin, the master of scouts, Eli, now a trusted guide, and a hardened veteran called Dragia. They met under boughs and in caves where smoke kept the chill out, and the talk was terse. They rehearsed responses, mapped lines of rumor, and argued about spectacle and restraint. One morning, Marin said softly, "We need a language that will be seen and understood across the border." Dragia replied, "You mean to terrify them?" The answer was yes, with a precision. The months of preparation involved recruiting carpenters like Pavel, paymasters like Stefan the Younger, and a small company of men who learned not only to fight, but to construct messages that would not be mistaken. This was not improvisation, it was engineering. The first public nighttime demonstration was staged with a grim choreography. Torches were arranged in a circle and poles were set upright like a new kind of palisade. Vlad invited a cluster of envoys and local leaders, including Petru the notary, Mircea the chamberlain, and a captured rebel named Oleg, who had been promised leniency. The crowd smelled roast meat and old smoke, and they stood with mugs steaming in frozen fingers. On a raised platform, Vlad spoke quiet words about justice, order, and the cost of betrayal. He then pointed to the poles. When the cloth covers were pulled away, the crowd craned forward. The poles carried bodies, not heads only, but full corpses, arranged with care, faces visible, eyes shaded with dirt to spare families the worst. The point was not mere mutilation, it was a lesson in consequence designed to be read at a distance. A whispered exchange near the platform became loud enough to be heard. A guard named Ion said, "Is that what he promised?" The envoy Stefan answered, "He promised control, and he keeps his promise." A woman in the crowd, Anna, wept quietly, and a boy covered his eyes, but stayed. The ritual stunned the region. People left telling stories and changing routes. Merchants rerouted caravans. Neighboring commanders sent letters asking if this was law or madness. At approximately 1/3 into this account, I will pause to address the unease you feel and ask you to speak back. I know this is difficult to watch in your mind, and you may feel a mixture of horror and grim fascination. If you want to help us understand modern echoes of such methods, start your comment with, "I felt," then name one reaction. Did you imagine yourself as a victim or as a bystander? How would you have responded in that moment in the clearing? Post a short thought beginning with, "I would have," and explain one action you would take. Would you run, hide, plead, or try to document? What you write matters because it shapes how future episodes are chosen and what lessons are emphasized. Your comments help create a conversation about where strategy becomes atrocity and about how communities remember trauma. Share one sentence and one question, and we will use them to shape future research and narrative choices. Now, back to the story. The diplomatic affronts were not random theater. They were calculated, symbolic mutilations meant to reframe honor and faith. A captured envoy from across the river had his fez nailed to a pole, a detail that set the clerics on edge. It was a visible denial of a mark of office, and it was meant to humiliate not merely the man, but his network. An Ottoman courier named Hassan, who walked into one of these scenes, later wrote in a letter that the act was like a grammar lesson in humiliation, and that every local reading it would internalize who was dominant. The technique worked on several psychological levels. First, there was visual imprinting. The human brain stores grotesque images with unusual ease. Then there was rumor psychology. Stories about what had happened spread faster than troops could move. Finally, there was associative punishment. The linkage between a social signifier and public degradation ensured that those who wore similar signs felt threatened. The act, a personal insult into a public law. In private councils, diplomats argued whether to condemn or to copy. Some argued for retaliation, others for subterfuge. Vlad had deliberately blurred lines so that enemies could not simply write him off as a criminal. He had become both magistrate and artist of menace.
To demystify the mechanics, one must be blunt. The process began with selection. The captives chosen for spectacle were rarely random. They were local leaders or people whose fate would echo through networks. Then came staging. Poles were prepared with crosspieces to hold weight, and ropes were treated to last in wet weather. Torches were placed to outline a silhouette that read from a distance. Each element served an amplifying function. A single pole with a body read as punishment. A row of poles read as policy. A ring of poles around a field read as territory denied. Psychologically, it operated like a shock and reorganize method. By hitting a population with a non-normative display that violated moral expectations, the ruler would break routine social cognition and produce a recalibration in which obedience could be seen as survival. There were also tactical aftereffects. Supply routes altered, recruitment slowed, spies were discouraged, and rumor networks shifted to protective behaviors. The aesthetic mattered too. Vlad favored arrangements that suggested a caveat or a border, a visual sentence that could be quoted in taverns and in diplomatic notes. The Ottoman commanders who wrote about these scenes described them as grotesque, but acknowledged their efficacy. Modern forensics would note that repetitive public violence creates both compliance and deepened resistance, depending on pre-existing social cohesion. In Vlad's context, the short-term gains in obedience were enormous, but the cultural scars were durable. The campaign of attrition that followed was neither pure siege nor classic pitched battle. It was an economy of pressure. Scouts led by Marin prowled supply lines. Small bands carried out night raids that burned granaries rather than towns, so that a whole region would be forced to the table by lack of food. One winter night, Vlad ordered a stealth attack on a command tent belonging to a sultanate lieutenant named Yusuf. The team included Dragia, Ilie, Pavel the carpenter who could climb like a cat, and a young archer called Sergio. The night was thick with frozen breath and a low mist that turned torchlight into halos. The dialogue that unfolded near the command tent was precise and long, and I will preserve it because it demonstrates method and mindset. Sergio whispered, "Are we sure?" Dragia replied, "Quiet now, we move when I say." Marin said, "Keep to the shadows," he said. "We take nothing but a message," Pavel said. "That message will speak loudest of all," Ilie said. "If we fail, we all die," Vlad said in a low voice. "Then fail we do not," Marin said. "On three." They moved like hunters. They cut ropes, blew little puffs of horn to confuse
dogs, and entered. Inside the tent, the Lieutenant Yusuf slept with a lamp guttering. The attackers tied him, wrapped him in a cloth, and carried him out to a circle of poles. Vlad wrote a short note which he nailed to the nearest stake. It read, "Here sits the consequence of invasion." The man was left alive, but shorn and exposed. He would be found by scouts at dawn, alive enough to speak, but altered so that he could not easily lead men afterward. The message reached the Sultanate, and the corridors of power shuddered. Some commanders counseled restraint, others argued for mirroring. The night attack had succeeded, not by killing, but by transforming a leader into a living cautionary tale. The forest of impaled poles that followed in later months was the apex of theatrical terror, and the point at which propaganda and psychology fused. Walking into that clearing was to walk into an argument about power. The air was thick with the metallic scent, and the bark of timber bore the scar of many hands. Vlad ordered the poles arranged like a cathedral nave, so that from a distance the verticals read as columns, and the bodies as banners. Observers reported a silence so complete that it seemed designed. An Ottoman scout named Ali, who later survived to tell the tale, said his stomach turned and that he wanted to laugh and vomit at the same time, a contradictory reaction that later psychologists would note as typical when the brain confronts moral violation. The visual taxonomy was deliberate. Heads placed at eye height were intended for passing merchants. Full bodies higher up were intended for rival troops approaching the region. Some poles bore inscriptions meant to be read by clerks and not by children. The result was a cascade effect. Neighboring troops, seeing the poles, hesitated. Civilians rerouted. Local elites sought immediate parley or fled. The psychological break was functionally successful. Yet inside Vlad, the practice began to change him. He slept less deeply and dreamed of names. He started choosing victims who had once been his friends, or who reminded him of his old captors. The ledger of justice became personal ledger, and this personal turn accelerated resentment inside his own court. Stefan the Younger wrote private notes warning of rot, and Mircea the Chamberlain began to avoid the prince's gaze. Consequences accumulated. Politically, Vlad consolidated territory, but relations with neighbors frayed into a web of fear and fragile treaties. Militarily, the short-term deterrent paid dividends in fewer open battles and more surrenders, but also in deeper resolve among the most offended factions. The Ottomans negotiated carefully. Some commanders whispered about assassination, others about siege. In the end, the method consumed some of its architect's compass. He grew suspicious of loyalists, of Stefan who kept accounts, of Petru who read ledgers, and of Ili who once comforted him. The court was less jovial and more watchful. There were plots, false rumors, and at least one failed poisoning attempt that sent Vlad into a season of purge and silence. He executed a handful of conspirators and then stared at the polls and saw his own reflection in wood and flesh. His legacy became a divided ledger. For some, he was a ruler who forced order where chaos reigned. For others, he was a man who weaponized dignity until nothing human remained human anymore. The final months of his rule were a study in solitude. 1 month later, the immediate tactical gains were visible. Trade routes around the valleys shifted, and grain convoys chose longer but safer roads. Villagers and border hamlets painted messages on doors, promising tribute and obedience to avoid the clearing. The merchants, including Goran and Luka, and a wealthy trader named Luka, recalculated their ledgers to account for higher transit costs. Official letters from Ottoman captains spoke in measured tones about reprisal and negotiation. Diplomats like Hassan and Mehmet opened channels not only to condemn, but to bribe and bargain. Within the principality, there was a window of stability. Taxes were collected, and courts ran with fewer robberies. The population complied because the pain of disobedience had become visible and immediate. Yet under the surface, trauma deepened. Families of the punished retreated into sorrow and radicalized quietly. Clerics, who had once tolerated harsh rulers for the sake of order, began to preach about mercy and warned that cruelty corrodes the soul of governance. The social fabric held, but under tension. 3 months later, the picture had shifted. A coalition of disgruntled nobles reached across rivers and into urban centers to form conspiracies that promised to replace terror with a different kind of order. Some of these nobles were led by a charismatic exiled boyar named Nikola and his lieutenant Oleg, who had survived public shaming and carried a personal hunger. The Ottomans sent envoys proposing deals that looked generous on paper. In the countryside, small acts of sabotage increased, and a rumor campaign attempted to reframe Vlad as a tyrant, not a savior. Foreign agents funded agitators and fostered samizdat-like pamphlets that circulated in market towns. Meanwhile, Vlad responded by tightening nets and by increasing the density of his messages. The polls were used more often and in more symbolic arrangements. But this repeated use diminished novelty, and novelty had been part of the method's power. In closed council, Mircea warned that the state was becoming dependent on spectacle as policy. Stefan the Younger argued that the book still balanced. The prince felt cornered and more willing to trust only those who had shared the caves months before. Personal paranoia made policy brittle. 6 months later, the long-term costs emerged with clarity. A region that had once been a transit corridor had become a wasteland of fear and depopulation. Young men were less willing to serve openly, and mercenaries began to charge more. Foreign powers recalibrated, and some chose containment rather than confrontation, creating a strategic limbo. The moral ledger left marks in memory
that outlived bodies. Songs started to speak of polls as lessons and to ask if law had become a spectacle. In the prince himself, the triumph had a shadow. He had secured borders and written a brutal grammar of obedience, but he had also hollowed out local institutions of mediation. The price was social trust. When an assassin found opportunity because he no longer trusted the court, the narrative of control collapsed into the narrative of vulnerability. The Ottomans whispered because they saw effectiveness and also contagious danger. They knew that terror worked, and also that it could bounce back and unsettle empires. Historians and psychologists looking back see a ruler who applied a logic that was brutal and, for a time, rational, and who eventually found that terror can master territory, but seldom heals the human ecology it wounds. In the end, the question remains alive. What do we learn from this when we study power and pain? The answer is not simple. The spectacle left an imprint that deterred and that enraged. It achieved short-term order and long-term fragmentation. It taught that violence, when used as language, must be read both as strategy and as confession. The final image endures, not because it was the most brutal, but because it was legible, a grammar of control that could be translated into behavior. Remember this as you judge the past and the present. If you want more investigations that trace how strategy becomes cruelty, subscribe and help us keep researching sources and testimony. Share this with someone who studies power and join the conversation in the comments. The last word is not victory or justice, but consequence, and consequence has a way of outliving those who imagine it.